In this video, we are going to have a very simple introduction to Flutter. We are going to talk about things such as what is Flutter, what makes it great, and why you should learn it. We are going to build our development environment. We are also going to build a simple app. We are going to talk about some of the things that you need to know in order to start building with Flutter. Later on, we're going to test the app. I'm going to show you how you can run these apps on a real emulator. And then we're going to close up with some of the other things that you need to know in order to build awesome apps using Flutter. So first of all, what is Flutter? Here I am at flutter.dev. This is the official page for Flutter. Now, Flutter is a framework that was originally built at Google using the Dart programming language. And one of the nice things about Flutter is that you can write your app once and you can run it on pretty much all the platforms. So I can write my app just once and I can run it on the web, on desktop, as well as on mobile, including iOS, iPhones, iPads, and Android devices. And that makes developing apps on the Flutter framework very, very time effective because I can just write my app once and I know for a fact, I'm guaranteed that it's going to run on all kinds of devices and all kinds of different platforms. Another really nice thing about Flutter is that it's reactive by default. And what that means is that it's very easy, at least it's fairly straightforward to build apps that automatically update as different things happen. So you can create an app that's updating different elements on the screen depending on the data it's getting via the network, or if a user is interacting with the app, or if something else is happening. And that's kind of what users want. They want reactive apps that react to their clicks, to their events, to whatever they're doing. You know, they don't want an app that takes a long time to change the screen or change some of the things about the UI. Users want things to happen right now, right here. And that's kind of what Flutter achieves. Now, obviously, there's a lot more benefits to using Flutter, and we're going to be covering them one by one throughout this video. But right now, let me show you how to create your development environment. So the first thing that you need to do is you need to search for an IDE. An IDE stands for an integrated development environment, and it's a piece of software that makes it easy and hassle-free to write apps, okay? And so one IDE that I recommend, which is 100% free, and it's one of the more popular IDEs, is called Visual Studio Code. So you can simply Google for Visual Studio Code, click this link, and you're gonna be on this page here. And all you need to do is come over here and you can download it for your platform. So whether you are on a Mac, on a Windows, or on a Linux machine, you can download it. I recommend using the stable build here. So you would basically click on one of the arrows here, depending on your platform. And once you download it, you're gonna have it looking something like this. Now that's the first thing that you need to do. The next thing that you need to do is you need to actually download Flutter Runtime, okay? And this is going to be the actual tools that are going to take the code that you're writing and turn it into something that can be executed on a machine. So you would head over to flutter.dev and you would click on this button here, Get Started, and you would install the runtime on your specific operating system. So whether you're using Windows, Mac, Linux, or Chrome OS, you would just click on your appropriate platform here and download the runtime. And you would simply follow up with instructions, and you would now have the runtime on your platform. Once you have both the IDE here as well as the Flutter runtime, which is very, very easy to install, The next thing you want to do is you want to launch your IDE and you want to execute Command Shift P or Control Shift P, depending on whether you are on a PC or on a Mac. And once you do that, you're going to be in this special kind of menu here. And assuming you've installed Flutter already, you installed the Flutter IDE, you're going to have an option here called Flutter. If you don't see that, you can just start typing Flutter, and you're going to see all the things that you can do with Flutter. So you can start a new project, you can run Flutter Doctor, you have other things here. And what are we going to do? We're going to start a new project here. Once you click on that, you're given a bunch of options that you can do. So you can start build an application, build a module, build a package, plugin, or a skeleton. For now, we're just going to keep it simple and we're going to build an application. We're going to click here. And the next thing that we need to do is we need to pick a directory where we are going to be storing this project, okay? So I'm going to pick just a random directory and I'm going to say select a folder to create the project in. And I'm going to name my application. So it has, suggested a name for me here. I'm just going to call it that. And I'm going to press enter to confirm. Once I do that, it's executing a bunch of things having to do with the Flutter runtime to create this project. And once everything is done, you're going to see a message that looks something like this that says, your Flutter project is ready. Press F5 to start running. You can close that. And on the left-hand side, you are going to see your Flutter project. So you're going to have basically a bunch of directories and a bunch of files inside this application here. This is what we called it. It's a directory. We just called it Flutter Application 5. And inside this lib directory, you're going to see this main file, main.dart. And this is kind of the main file where everything starts, right? Where everything starts. Now, before I give you a quick walkthrough of what you're seeing here, and this is very, very important, I want to show you a couple of things with this IDE. So on the left-hand side, you have different things that you can do. So we are inside the Explorer pane. You can do a search. So you can search all your files. You have source control here. So we don't have a repository here, but later on, when you're building, working with more complex projects, you're going to be initializing repositories. Here, you can run apps, run and debug. Now, I want to bring to your attention this extension tab here, okay? This IDE, Visual Source Code, comes with these extensions, and these extensions make your life easier depending on what you're doing. So with Flutter, you're going to have extensions that help you build amazing apps. And so if you look at my extensions, I have a lot of extensions, but the ones you want to pay attention to are things like this Flutter extension here. I also have this Dart extension, but then I also have a couple of optional extensions that make it easy to build apps. And I'm going to show you exactly what they do a little bit later in the video. But when you're starting out, you want to have this Dart extension, and you also want to have this Flutter extension. Okay, these are kind of mandatory. And later on, you can install some optional extensions. So I recommend something like Flutter Tree. Flutter widget snippets are all really, really nice, highly rated, very useful extensions that make your life a lot easier as a Flutter developer. So once you have all of this installed, there's a lot of other extensions. We can cover that later. You can kind of take a look at some of the other things here. You can come to Flutter, and assuming you have the main Flutter extension, you will be able to see kind of a tree structure on the left-hand side of the app that you're building. So I'm going to show you how that works in just a second. And also, if you head down to the status bar here, you will also see some interesting pieces of data that you should take a note of. So we have the current line, the current column that's going to change depending on what you're doing. You have the spaces, which is the tab spaces. That's kind of what you want. You can change that. You always want to be indenting using spaces as the first thing, but you can change how many that is. We have 2 spaces, which is fine. And here we have the language mode. So you always want it to be on Dart, and it should be by default on Dart, but there could be situations where maybe something didn't work and it didn't detect the right code that you're using. So you want to make sure this is on Dart. And here we have the target device. So remember I said that with Flutter, you can build apps that target different platforms. So like desktop, web, mobile, iOS, Android, things like that. So here I'm targeting my Mac OS machine, which is my desktop machine. So if I click on it, this thing pops up and I can target other devices. So I can switch to Chrome, which is building a web app. So if I click here, now it's targeting Chrome. If I click here again, I can target a iOS, so I can run my app on the iOS simulator, or I have a couple of Pixel emulators here as well, or I can create another Android emulator. This section where we are talking about different mobile emulators, I'm going to be covering a little bit later in the video, but right now it's important to know that this is what you see here is what kind of app you're going to be building. Okay. So I can switch it to Chrome, I can switch it to desktop, it doesn't really matter, but later on when you're building apps, you want to make sure that you have this thing selected here. And when you're ready to run the app, you can come over here to this run, you can start debugging or run without debugging, and you can also come to this corner right here and pick either start debugging or run without debugging. So if you have run without debugging, it's going to go ahead and create this app and run it for you. So we're going to do that in just a second. And now that we talked about the IDE, there's obviously a lot more things that we can cover, but hopefully the things that I talked about are enough for you to kind of get started and hit the ground running. Now let's take a look at this sample app that was created for us as part of the new app that we built. And while we are looking at the code, I want to share with you some of the important concepts when it comes to Flutter, some of the basic universal concepts when it comes to Flutter. And this is going to help you to build the foundation when you're out building apps. Now, the first thing that you need to understand is all of this is Dart code. Now, if you're not familiar with the Dart programming language, I strongly urge you to check out one of my earlier videos, which is a comprehensive tutorial on the Dart programming language for beginners. So it's an awesome tutorial if you have little or no experience when it comes to the Dart programming language, because Flutter is a framework that's built using a specific programming language. In this case, this is the Dart programming language. And so you definitely need to know some of the concepts. And while you don't need to be an expert when it comes to the Dart programming language, you don't need to be a pro. It's going to be very helpful if you can understand some of the more simple concepts. That's going to help you to kind of get started and at least make sense of some of the simple apps, as well as what I'm talking about here. So definitely recommend it if you have not done so. So once we import our Flutter framework, because if we don't import, none of this is going to work. Okay, you would just have a basic Dart app, but it's not going to know what all of this is. This is very, very important. This is what gives us the power of the Flutter framework. We have a main function here, and this is a function that returns nothing and takes no parameters. And this is the entry point inside the app. When the app is ran, it looks inside this main function and it executes whatever is in there. So if you don't have anything there, then nothing is going to show on the screen, because it's not going to know what to execute. Now, inside the main function, we have another function here, and this is part of the Flutter framework. It's called run app. And the purpose of this function is to run the app that we provide as an argument. In this case, it's expecting a widget, and not just any kind of widget, a specific widget that creates an app that serves as kind of the scaffolding, the outline, everything that holds the app. Now, remember I mentioned that everything in Flutter is a widget. So if we run the app, if we quickly run the app, you should be able to visually view all the elements and think of them as widgets. So first of all, this entire app is a widget. Okay, so this is our app here. It says my app, stateless widget. But inside, we also have various widgets. So this text is a widget. This area here is a widget. This is a widget. This thing is a widget. This thing is a widget. All the independent things that you're seeing, they are individual widgets. Now, you can have just widgets. You can have children of a widget. You can have children of widgets, meaning grandchildren. You essentially can have a tree of different widgets. So you can have, an app as at the top, and then you can have maybe two widgets that, display maybe an app bar here, and then maybe a container here, and then a container can have another widget, a child widget, and that child widget can have other widgets. So it's not just widgets. It's more like, yeah, you can have, widgets on the same level, but you can also have different children, right? And in fact, most of the time, if you're building a very complex app, you're going to have lots of different children. You're going to have a parent-child relationship. So you can have a widget that, it's not just there by itself, but it has its own other widgets inside of it. And so when you're thinking about Flutter, I want you to think, most importantly, that everything is a widget, and those widgets may have children, or they may not have children, right? It really depends on the app, but everything is a widget. And so if we come back to our app here, our very, very simple app that was created, you will see that we have this My App, okay? And every widget that you create, right, it's going to have a build method, okay? This is an important thing, right? You can have other methods depending on what you're doing, but you're going to have a build method. And the purpose of the build method is to build the widget that needs to be shown, okay? You have a widget, but what is that widget? Well, that's what the build method is doing. That build method is assembling that widget, and then it returns the widget. So as you can see, build, it takes a build context, and then it returns a widget. So you don't have to worry about the build context right now. That is something I'll cover sometime down the road. It's not important for this specific tutorial, but it's important to see that it returns a widget. And so that widget could be a text widget, it could be an image widget, it could be lots and lots of different kinds of widget, but that is what it does. And so you create a widget, and then you create a method, and that builds the widget. And so that way, when the Flutter runtime is displaying the app, it runs through each of these widgets and it calls the build method, and it gets the final widget to be displayed. I know I'm kind of going a little bit ahead, but that is kind of how it works. Otherwise, without the build method, it's not going to know, what to display. What is the actual widget made of? So we have this My App widget, which is our initial widget. But if you take a look at this home here, and so we have this title, we have a theme, we're specifying that it's blue, and that is kind of this top area here, right? It's blue. But we also have a home area, and that calls something called My Home Page with a title. And My Home Page is another widget. And so we created that app, but now we need to create this stuff inside, right? So things like Flutter Demo Homepage, this area, all the stuff here. And that is taken care of by this My Home Page widget here, okay? And now there's lots of things happening, and I'm gonna get to that in just a second. But before we talk about the different types of widgets that you can use, I want to talk about the two main types of widgets that you're going to have everywhere. So regardless what kind of widgets you're going to be dealing with, and you're going to be building many widgets depending on the kind of app you're going to be dealing with, primarily there are going to be two types of widgets. Either you're going to have a stateless widget here, or you're going to have a stateful widget. So as you can see, our app is a stateless widget. It's a subclass of a stateless widget. You see, it's a class, it extends the stateless widget. But we also have My Homepage, which extends the stateful widget. So what is the difference between two of them, okay? It's important to make that distinction. A stateless widget is a widget that's never going to change. You create it, and it's always going to be the same for the lifetime of the app. So if I create it now, the user runs the app, they launch the app, no matter what they do, they're messing around with the app, they're clicking something, they're looking at something, that widget will always look the same. That is a stateless widget. It means that widget does not have state. It doesn't have something that tells it how to look and how to behave, okay? The second type of widget is a stateful widget. And that is a widget that may change depending on something that might happen with the app. And what I mean by something is it could be user input, it could be maybe talking to a website, a network request, it could be maybe a scrolling Maybe it has a timer, like every 60 seconds it does something, every 60 minutes it does something. But regardless what happens, that widget is going to change the way it looks, maybe the way it behaves throughout the runtime of the app. Now, I will talk more about state a little bit later in the video. It's important to understand. It's a very, very important topic. But right now, I want to show you the app, and I want to explain to you that, for instance, there are parts of this app that are not changing. They will never change. So maybe this title is never going to change. Maybe this text is never going to change. But there are certainly parts of this app that are changing as I'm interacting with the app. So if I'm clicking the button, you see this is changing. So this widget, it's definitely not a stateless widget or something related to this widget because it has state. It's understanding that, for instance, I click 3 times, and obviously if I restart the app, it's going to be at 0 again. But while the app is running, it's keeping track, right? State is about keeping track of something that has happened throughout the app. And obviously, as you're building more complex apps, you're going to have more complex state, because an app without state is like a web page. You know, it doesn't have anything. It's just displaying data for you. And that's obviously not why we are learning Flutter and why we are learning Dart, because we want to create reactive apps. We want apps to do amazing things. And that's also why Flutter is very reactive. That is because it keeps state and is able to display. Now I'm going to get to state. We're going to cover it in greater detail a little bit later in the video, but I just wanted to give you a taste of why it's so important. Now that we've covered that there are 2 main types of widgets that you have to kind of keep in the back of your mind, such as stateless widget and a stateful widget, I want to quickly talk about different kinds of widgets that you can use in order to kind of build the UI. Now, Flutter has tons and tons of widgets, right? There are all kinds of widgets that enable you to do amazing things. But in the general sense, there are kind of 2 categories that I kind of like to think about. They're the widgets that help you position the text on the screen, and they're the widgets that help you kind of display something, okay? So the widgets that help you position stuff on the screen, they're not widgets that you can actually see. They're widgets that a developer such as yourself or myself, we specify. They're kind of like instructions that help you position the widgets that you can see. So if we scroll down, you can see that we have this body here, which is part of scaffold, right? This my homepage is a scaffold, and it's kind of this you can think about as a scaffolding in the app, because we have an app here. This my app has an app, and it returns this my homepage, whereas my homepage returns a scaffold, right? So we're getting a little bit deeper. It's like an onion, right? We have an app, we peel off those layers of the onion, and inside we have a scaffold, and then the scaffold has an app bar, it has a body. So we have an app bar, which is this thing right here. This is the app bar, but we also have the body, and this is just below the app bar, everything that's below the app bar. Now, here we have a tree structure of widgets. A really easy way to see the types of widgets that you have is by coming over here and clicking on this Flutter icon here, this section here. And when you click on it, you have this really nice representation of kind of what your app looks like, of the tree of widgets. So we have this main function, we have this my app, and we are not interested in that. We're interested in my homepage. And so we have this homepage state, and then we have the build, and now we have all of these widgets that are being built. So we have the my scaffold, we have the app bar, and then we have kind of the body of the app. So we have center column, we have this text, and then we have a floating action button, okay? So this center right here, this thing here, that is an example of a widget that helps you with layout, okay? So if you wrap another widget with a center, this is kind of what happened here. This column is wrapped in a center, wraps the column, means that everything inside the column is going to be centered, right? Which is why all of this is centered, because otherwise it would have been left justified, right? Now, I also mentioned a column, right? Columns and rows are like the basic building blocks when it comes to building your app. A column allows you to organize things from top to bottom. So if I have a column and then I place widgets inside of it, they're going to be one above the other, right? So if I place this one first, it's going to be here. I place Another widget is going to be just below it. A row allows you to organize things horizontally, whereas a column is vertical, a row is horizontal. So in this case, we have a center, then we have a column, and then we have two text widgets. Okay? And that is why one is above the other. If this was a row, so if we change that to a row and we run the app, you're going to see it aligned horizontally. So let me go ahead and reload the app. And now you see it's horizontally, okay, which we definitely need some spacing, a little bit of formatting, but now we change the behavior. And that is because we used a row instead of a column. So things like row, column, there's a couple of other ones, you can have a stack, there's a couple of other ones that allow you to these basic ways of aligning things, right? So I'm going to change this back to row. I'm going to reload the app, and now it's aligned as a column. Okay. Now, if we scroll down, this floating action button has a bunch of things that it's working with. So we can specify what happens when we press it. We have a tooltip, and then we have a child, which appears as the child of that button, right? This button needs to have its own child, and the child is a widget. So you can have any widget that you want as a child. You can have an image, you can have an icon, you can have text, you name it, right? And this is what kind of makes Flutter so flexible and yet so powerful, is that it's just a collection of widgets. Not only do we have, like a text widget, which is kind of something that makes sense, something that you would expect, but we also have layout elements as widgets themselves that kind of wrap around parts that we want to affect with this layout. So we have center, we have column, we have a floating action button. Now, when we go down to this floating action button, that is the first example of actual logic inside of this app, because without this floating action button, we're just displaying things, right? We don't really have a true app. But with the floating action button, and we also have this tooltip that essentially gives us a hint of what might happen once we actually click on this, right? So it says increment, and this is this value right here. Now, one nice thing about Flutter is that it allows you to preview the app very, very quick. Let's say I want to change a little bit of text here. So instead of you, I change to I. All I need to do is save this file, and it's automatically going to reload just that part that was changed. So take a look at this. It says you, I save it, it reloads it. Now it says I. That's called a hot reload. And the reason it's hot is because it just reloads the part that was changed. It doesn't reload the whole app. That would be like a cold reload. You have that too. So if you scroll up, you can see that you can, debug the app, you can pause execution, but you also have something like this that does a hot reload, or you can do a restart, which is a cold reload. Here you can stop, or you can look at the widget inspector page that I'm going to show you in just a second. And so what we have here is we have a column, we have two fields that are going to be aligned, one above the other in kind of vertical fashion. And then we have a floating action button that appears right here, okay? Now, as you are writing code and you're trying to build different functionality, one nice thing that you should be aware of is that if you hover over something, you will see some of the things that this particular widget or function or class takes in. So this floating action button, right? Look at how many things you can pass to it, right? You have a child widget, you can pass a key, a tooltip, foreground color, background color, but it also has one function, right? You see, this is one function, this is onPress, and this is what we're passing here, this increment counter function. Now, if we scroll up, we see this function here, this increment counter that calls something called setState, which I'm going to talk about in just a second. That has to do with state, but it only calls that one function here, and that function just calls one other function here. And so that is an example of a very, very simple app that basically does two things. It displays a bunch of widgets, displays a bunch of information for the user to take into account, but it also allows you to interact with the app, right? Because we have a button where if we click it, this thing gets updated, right? The state gets updated. Now, let's talk a little bit about state and why it's so important. So just like I mentioned early in the video, if you did not have state, you would just have an app that would just display the same thing. And yeah, you might have a button here and there or some kind of input. That app would never change the way it looks. It would never get updated. And that is because in order to build reactive apps, which is kind of what we want to do. We want the app to react without the user having to reload the app or click on something to see some data. We want the app to react to user events or some kind of external events. We need to use state, okay? And there are different ways of doing state with Flutter. There are very, very simple approaches to a lot more complicated approaches. Now, in terms of more complicated approaches, that is a perfect topic for a future video. So that's going to be something I'm going to be covering in the future. But when it comes to simple things, you can use something called setState. And so without getting too complicated here, let me explain to you what's happening here and why it's so important for you guys to understand it sooner than later. Because when you're going to be building apps, you're going to be building reactive apps, and they're going to be using state all over the place. So you need to understand how this works. Now, inside our widget, we are using a stateful widget, and that means we have this state class here, as opposed to this widget, which does not have the state class. Now, inside the state class, we have one variable called a counter, and this is part of state. In this example, we just have one variable, but you can have many variables, right? You can have a ton of variables. This is your state variable. This variable should change as things are happening with the app. So a perfect example is that we have this floating action button, and unpressed, we're passing a function here, right? Increment counter. And if we go up, this is the function here. And what we want to do is we want to update our state variable. This is not just any counter. This is a special counter that once we click on it, we want that main X amount of times that we click on it, that value to be updated, okay? We want that value to be updated. But just updating that value is not enough. We also need to show that value. And the magic here is that because you are updating this value inside setState, wherever you are using that value, that's going to be updated. That widget is going to be rebuilt, and the new value is going to show up. It's very, very important to understand this, because this is one of the key concepts of Flutter, this kind of reactive state management. And so take a look at these two widgets. Remember, we have a column and we have two widgets that are going to be aligned one on top of the other, right? So we have this one widget called I have pushed the button too many times. That will never get updated, right? This is just, just static text, right? Text literal. But the second one includes a counter, right? And remember, a counter is a variable that's inside our state, and we're updating here inside setState. And so what happens here is that when we run setState, it understands that this variable is referenced in this text widget. And because we are updating that variable, Flutter knows that it needs to rebuild this widget automatically. And so instead of changing this widget, in Flutter, all widgets are final, right? Widgets are not like modifiable by the runtime, okay? And so what happens here is that because this widget is inside setState, because we are telling Flutter effectively that, when a person clicks on something, that is a change of state. Flutter understands that, and as a result, it's able to, destroy this old widget with this old number. So if it was 0 and we clicked on something, it should be 1. It's going to destroy a widget with 0. It's going to increment it. So now our counter is 1, and it's going to rebuild that new widget. That is kind of why it's happening. And that is why it's setState. If I remove setState, and let's say I comment that out and I rerun the app, that widget will never get updated because it's not part of state. We're not telling Flutter that is state. So here's our app, and it says here, I've pushed this button many times. We have this button, but no matter how many times I click on it, this never gets updated. Our value variable here, state variable, gets updated, but because we're not calling setState, Flutter does not understand. It does not know that it needs to update that variable where it's referenced, because we're not telling it that that's part of state. So now if I uncomment the function and I reload the app, now it understands that whenever we update that variable, we want to do it as part of state. And now as a result, it's going to see that, oh, we're using this counter here. We need to destroy it and to create a new one because this is part of state, right? Very, very important. And like I said, this is the simplest way to manage state, and it's going to be useful in very, very simple apps. As you're going to be building more complex apps, you're going to have different so-called state management solutions that you're going to be using. And obviously some of these solutions can get fairly complex, fairly complicated, and that is going to be a topic for a future video where I'm going to be covering some of the more complex state management solutions. So definitely subscribe. It's going to be a lot of very, very cool Dart and Flutter content coming up. And so now that we covered the different types of widgets, things like stateless widgets, stateful widgets. We talked about widgets can be layout widgets, widgets can be displaying widgets, so like a text, image, floating button, things like that, an icon here. That's a widget that you actually see. Let's go ahead and run this app on an iOS emulator so that you can see how your app would look like on a real emulator. So all I have to do is come in here. I'm going to start an iOS emulator. And so we just loaded an iOS simulator here, and this works exactly like a real device. I can also change what kind of device I have. So I can come in here, I can restart it, I can rotate it, I can change some of the settings here. I can change what kind of device I have, right? I'm using iPhone 14 Pro, iOS 16.1. And what I can do now is once I have it running here, I can actually run my app, and it's going to run it on a simulator. And the nice thing about running your app on a simulator is that if it runs on a simulator, it's pretty much it's a guarantee it's going to run on a real device, right? That is what simulators are for. So right now I'm building my app specifically for an iOS device, and once it finishes building, we'll be able to preview the app on a simulator. So it finished building the app, and when we come to the simulator, we can see that now we are viewing this app on the simulator. And so this is how your app would look like on an iOS device. And if you click on it, you see it's updating, our state is working fine, everything is good. We can also open another simulator. So for instance, let's say we want to check out an iPad Pro. We can simply open that. And so it's actually going to simulate it loading like a real actual iPad Pro device. And now we can choose our new simulator here, in this case iPad Pro 12.9 inches, and we can run our app on this simulator on an iPad Pro simulator. And so it's going to be building the app and launching it momentarily. All right, and now our app is running on a real iPad Pro 12.9 inch simulator, and this is kind of how it looks. We have that state working fine. We have these apps running on two different simulators side by side, different instances of the app, and it looks good. It looks good. It allows me to test. It allows me to see how the app is going to look, and in this case it looks fine. If if I saw something that I didn't like, I may need to change how the app is displayed, maybe some of the layout settings, but right now it looks great. I'm happy how it looks. And after testing the app in a real simulator, if I like how everything looks, it behaves perfectly. There are no bugs, there are no issues, there's no layout issues. I know that I'm confident that whenever I launch the app, whenever I submit it to an app store, for instance, users will download the app. It's going to appear on their devices exactly how I tested it out on the simulator. So that is why it's very, very powerful to test it on your target platform. And in this case, you don't even need to have the actual device. Maybe I am an Android user. I don't have access to iOS devices. No problem. I can test it out on the simulators. And also the reverse. Maybe I am an iOS user. I don't have Android devices. No problem. I can test it out on Android simulators very, very easily. And so that will do it for our introduction to the Flutter framework. I really, really hope you've gotten value here. At least you've learned what Flutter is, what Flutter is capable of, and how you can start at least getting your way around the development environment, at least some of the things that you can do with Flutter, and at least you feel a little bit more comfortable in terms of how Flutter works and how you can build different widgets. Now, in future videos, I'm going to have more in-depth content when it comes to building various Flutter apps, some of the more advanced techniques, as well as more videos on Dart. So if you enjoyed this video, definitely let me know by leaving a comment below, liking this video, and subscribing to the channel so that you do not miss future videos. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you in the next video.